So we get into biomechanics. We're looking at engineering, physics, anthropometry, basic medical sciences, and obviously the mathematical relationships between those two. And it's just basically, when you break it apart, it's looking at mechanical problems, but applying it to biologic systems, right? Putting those two together. So in terms of outcomes right there, we're going to look at the laws of physics and describe the biologic phenomena in the body. We're going to look at forces and torques. We're going to determine the strength limitations, predict stressful work postures and conditions. One of the reasons why I spend 2 lectures on this particular topic is because it is the only formula ever produced by the federal government that gives you some risk for back injury. A quantitative index to tell you that if you're lifting this in this position, that you're at a certain risk for getting a back injury. There's nothing else out there like it. Nothing on the upper limbs, nothing on the lower limbs, only on the back. And the reason is bad backs are big bucks, right, in terms of cost. So the government has been wanting to do something about this for a long time. So that's why it's there. Body segments then are assumed to be rigid links, rotate about centers. Rigid body mechanics then are based on Newton's laws, which all of you should be familiar with. Among those forces, and then static and dynamic analyses can be used for rigid body mechanics. Like we're a rigid body in terms of segments, we're not like worming around and so on. But the thing is that we're going to focus on will be on the static aspects of biomechanics and not the dynamics. Dynamics require computerized modeling and so on and so forth, because what we're going to do in here on Tuesday is I'm going to do a stop action segment of a move like this, say what is the risk for a back injury in this position given the external load that I have. Let's say it's 20 pounds, 30 pounds, whatever, in my hands. And then I'll get a finished position and say, well, now what is the risk? Something like this. In a dynamic aspect, it would be reaching down, picking something up, and looking at acceleration, momentum, transfer of the weights and so on, twisting, all of that, all in a series of photographs that basically now does a connection between one position to the other and shows you those dynamics. So here, it's stop action, that's your static, and movement, continuous moving of force, that's a dynamic. So I want you to know that distinction between the two. Dynamic force calculations are out there. They have to be done with a computer just because they're very sophisticated and they're always changing, right? So when we look at mechanics then, obviously we have our liquids and our solids and our gases, and we're interested, of course, in the biomechanics on our solids. We have deformable bodies and rigid bodies, so we're interested in rigid bodies. And then, as I mentioned to you, we have dynamics and statics. And then in dynamics, offshoots of that are kinematics and kinetics. And I expect you to know the difference between the two, which ones use force, which ones just look at movement. So I can tell you that right now, but I want you to think about that. Why? Because it is going to be a quiz question. It's probably going to be an exam question. So know the difference between kinematics and kinetics, which ones involve force, and which ones just involve movement. Statics and dynamics then. The body at rest involves the calculation, composition, resolution of forces and moments and torques. And dynamics, well, now we're looking at the same as that, but the body is in motion, just as I demonstrated a little earlier. Our kinematics then now, this is where we're coming to that. As you've been thinking about that, describes the body without, here we go, considering forces, right? The longer word, kinematics. Okay, we're looking at velocity, time-related and change, acceleration. This is time rate of change and so on. When we get into kinetics, these are now forces that can act on the body. So kinetics now we're dealing with forces, kinematics we're not. We're dealing with movement. And in this case here, we're looking at forces both internal and external. Now this is very important to keep in mind, fundamentally understand this, is that let's say I have a 50-pound load and I'm holding it right here. Intuitively, you can probably work this out. Am I more at risk, same weight, no change in the weight, still 50 pounds, and am I more at risk in this position or in this position or in this position? So give me the A, B, and C. A being the worst, B being next, C being the third. So this is going to be C. right? You think that intuitively this looks good relative to the other two. So is it worse this way or this way? So which one's A, which one's B? So forward flexion and a twist. We're going to how many are going for the twist, forward flexion and the twist called lateral rotation? Why is that? Why do you think?
Because your body's not like in its normal position.
Not normal position, but what's happening when I twist? When I flex forward and I twist, what's happening? The weight distribution is uneven, right? So I'm putting more tension on one side of my body than the other, right? So you're putting more tension, so now you're putting yourself more at risk because you're more unstable, right, in this position. You're still not doing great here, right, in the flexion. So why is this worse than this? What do you think this, or don't you think that way? You're thinking this is worse than this?
Yeah.
Why? You know, you felt it, right? You say, whenever you've done this, it hurts. It's even worse this way. But why? Why is that?
The weight is more distributed.
Well, let's take a look at this right here. This is the answer right here. Forces that we're looking at this are external. I gave you the 50-pound load, right? But also the force is internal, right? Why? Because this has weight. This has weight. This has weight. So I'm taking myself from here and leaning forward. Now all those forces internally are also added up to the external forces that you have in hand. So that's why this is not a good position. It's much more stressful than being in this position. This is not great for 50 pounds, but certainly better than this. Why? Because you have to add on these forces as well because they weigh, right? So anytime you're out of a stable position like this, you have to add those forces into it, and that increases the risk for back injury. Forces defined, we've gone through that. You've seen this before in your physics class, but just basically looking at 1 Newton, the amount of force required to accelerate a mass, 1 kilogram per meter per second. So this is what we're looking at in terms of force, and hold you responsible for this. And then all of you should know this: force equals mass times acceleration. So now we have the acceleration component in there, and we have mass that we're dealing with. So it's how much movement we're having over time, right? So when we deal with work then, what is work all about? So it's basically a resisting force on a body produced by motion. The amount of work is calculated to be, look at the effective force and distance through which force acts. Therefore, work is, I hold you responsible for this, defined as force times distance. Not force plus distance, not force minus distance, force times distance. That's how work is defined in terms of something being done. When we look at energy, the ability of the body to do work, so we have potential energy, and of course you've all seen this, potential energy and kinetic energy. So the ability of the body to absorb work because of its position or state, and then here we have the kinetic energy, the ability of the body to do work because of its motion. So, what kind of energy is this? There you go. Boom, got it, nailed it. Potential and kinetic, right? Potential to do the work being done. Rate of performing work then per unit time. We have power, we have average power, this is force times velocity, and the principle then here is work input, and it seems rather obvious right here, but work input equals useful work output against friction. So when I keep talking about the principles of work and design, the idea that we're shooting for here is that we're trying to minimize this as much as possible, right? So by organizing work, we can have more useful work output. What we put into it, we're going to try to get out of it, but we're going to try to resist this. This is very much like riding a bike with the brakes on, right? Or driving your car suffering, but a car with the brake on, something of that nature. But something you physically feel because things are working against you, and that's the friction. So things that are not in harmony, these are the things that you look for and try to get rid of it. So mechanical advantage, remember we talked about this. I told you I was going to come back to this whole business, mechanical advantage. We have actual and ideal. It's important to know the distinction with these. Actual mechanical advantage then is force exerted by a machine or load over the force used to operate the particular machine. So that's your resistance over the effort. And remember what we worked through the other day, right, in terms of that equation. And we talked about the lever systems, right, lever 1, 2, and 3. And then we have the ideal mechanical advantage, and this is the distance moved by applied force over the distance moved by the load. In this case here, we have the force arm over the resistance arm. Note the difference between the two in terms of what the actual is versus what the ideal is. Yes?
That to me is somewhat confusing because I thought in the equation we learned that the resistance times the resistance arm minus the, I guess, the effort times the effort arm equals to 0.
Mm.
So then will it be the same value? Because that's what we thought, right?
From the lecture before?
From in the book itself, in chapter 4.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, well, what that's saying, what the question is that if we're looking at work and resistance and we're going to put a 0 in that equation, what that's stating is that you're going for equilibrium, right, in terms of those forces. Because if you don't have equilibrium, that you're not going to get work done. Things are not going to work out in terms of the energy input versus energy output.
So at equilibrium, ideal.
Right. It's equals 0, so that's what you're trying to find is that equilibrium in that equation. So when we're looking at this, let's go one step further now and look at this. When we look at resistance over effort versus the force arm over the resistance arm in terms of what's the difference between my actual versus my ideal, where do you want to be on this in terms of having that work for you? You want to reach equilibrium, but you don't want to be working against that in terms of the friction, if you will. That is what you're discussing, is that you now have a loss in that equation in terms of work in versus work out. Let me go to a couple more slides, see if this makes more sense to you, okay? So here we have, this is what we're looking at, the ideal mechanical advantage. And in this case then, we're looking at efficiency, momentum, and impulse, work output over work input. And we have momentum, this is your mass of body over the velocity, and then your impulse, this impulse is like impact, like push. So when we look at force times length of time, in this case, is that now it's basically looking at an impulse or a sudden acceleration, right? So think about that. So something moving like this versus something moving faster. And so when you're looking at those differences there, now you're talking about impulse. Question?
I was just going to say, is your clicker
Oh, this thing here? Yeah. They're taking, yeah, we're taking a test, I guess, huh? What happened there? Thank you for that, yeah. That's question 2. You missed the first one, didn't you? What happened here? There we go. Can we minimize that? Get rid of that thing too? Or I'm dangerous up there. You know me. I've got that pin flying all over the place.
There we go.
All right. We'll get it out of the way. Thank you.
Better?
Yeah.
If we click the minus, it should get it off the screen altogether. Or at least got rid of most.
Well, it's tiny. It's pretty tiny now. You made it harder for me to mess it up. Thank you for pointing that out. Of course, it now no longer works. Uh-oh. Come on. There we go. Woo. So our friction and torque then. Our friction then, we're looking at the force exerted tangentially, right, to the surface of an object on another and resist motion, or either the surface relative to the other. And torque is really what we want to get in terms of movement. And of course, torque is related to the length, right, when we think about the resistance arm. So in this case, the effective force produced rotation about an axis measured by the product of that force and the perpendicular distance, that former axis of rotation and the line of action of that particular force. So it's like anything that you think about in terms of leverage. So for example, if I want to lift this right here, if I'm lifting at this stage, right here I have to apply a certain amount of torque or force to lift this up. But if I had a long bar, like a crowbar, right, and I'm able to lever it out here with that pivot point down there, the fulcrum, it's a lot easier to lift, right? I can have a lot more torque and have basically more force applied to this, and if this doesn't want to come loose here, you can break it loose with a longer lever. So that would be your concept of using torque. So in our effort then is a product of the torque times the duration in which the force is sustained, and I'm not going to hold you responsible for memorizing this equation, but I would like you to certainly understand the principles of that, where we're looking at effort, moment, time. This is your duration that you're sustaining the force. Force is known in this case as the actual weight being handled, and then that perpendicular distance of the axis of rotation. In other words, that extension out that's being applied. Gravitational acceleration, we know that is 9.8 meters per second. Our normal compressive and tensile forces are tangential forces, and then our stress. And this is a force applied to 1 unit of surface area, 1 Pascal, 1 Newton per meter squared, in this case, looking at this aspect of tangential when we're looking at stresses. Right here, these are your shear forces, and these are the forces, for example, that are trying to go this way. So when I talk about like leaning forward, this kind of thing, what's happening is, yes, we're having a lot of tension on erector spinae muscles, right? And we know the counteractive forces here, we talked about them, right? The gluteus maximus muscles, right? And the hamstrings, keeping us up here. The other forces flexing forward would be all up in the pelvis, that area. So when we look at these shear forces, we're looking at the spine is basically those forces that are going this way. So we have compressive this way, and we have shear, and then we have rotational. So these shear forces have become very, very important, especially if we're pulling on a big load in front of us here. Make sense to everybody? So we're going to focus on the back. Let me get through this, and then we'll do our quiz, and then I'll start getting into the biomechanical equation a little bit with you. Of course, you know, we've gone sort of full cycle right here, right, through this. The other day I was looking at a professor older than myself, and he obviously it was just years and years and years of just being stooped over a desk and working, and just this kind of thing right here, just walking away, and this is the kind of thing that it sort of evolves back to. So obviously for the ladies, there's a big thing they're very focused on in terms of osteoporosis and so on. Men have some of these issues as well that comes into play. Most of it is because they're just not working on what they call the non-glamour muscles, and to pull the shoulders back and straighten them out. And then over time, they just kind of look like that. Not good. So with the spine, low back injuries, you'll be tested on this. So I'm going to circle the ones that I'm going to come back to. All right, get ready for this. So we get outward. It's in the billions in terms of cost. It's going up. These are direct related. But the ones you want to look at right here, the highest are in the L5-S1. That's the 5th lumbar, 1st sacral joint. That's where most of your injuries are occurring. So you have 5 lumbar, right? And that 5th lumbar and then the 1st sacral joint right there is where most of your back injuries occur. The next is in the L4, L5. That's not on the notes, but that's the reason you attend class, because that's the second most common injury. And I'll write that down for you. So this is first. Second, L4 to L5. 4th lumbar, 5th lumbar area. It makes sense. Why? Because when we look at the spine, right here, that we have the cervical area, thoracic area, the lumbar area right here, and the movement, there's your L5-S1 right here, that, as you remember from my talk a little bit earlier, is that we have flexion extension here, lateral bending, and axial rotation. So we have this movement in our spine, but when you look at the cervical area, look at our range, and you can do this all yourselves, right? You've got, okay, nice movement here in terms of range of motion, but look at the, doggone it. Goodness gracious. Mike, you're not doing that, are you? No. All right, I just want to make sure. Because he can do magic things from just where he is. Look at the thoracic area. These are the degrees of movement right here. Look at how little movement that there is. And then look at the lumbar area, right? And so the difference is in the cervical area, you can do this, but it's a lower load. Why? It's only supporting 12, 13 pounds of mass, right? But when you get down to the lumbar area, now you've got your entire torso, you've got your arms, you've got your neck and your head. And if you remember from what I talked about a little bit earlier in terms of weight of segments, most of the weight in your body is here up, right? It's over 60%. So now we're putting all that weight on the lumbar area, and because there's little movement here, and why is there little movement here, connecting the dots with the thoracic vertebrae? Because of the connection to the ribs, right? The ribs connect to the thoracic vertebrae, and so when you turn this way, all the lumbar movement is happening down here, but the thoracic vertebrae are going in unison with the ribs. So they're basically working in concert, whereas these are working independently. So now you have an unstable column down here, and you have high forces. The combination of the two is the reason we have so many injuries related to backs down in that area. And the further down you go in the lumbar, the greater the risk because the compressive forces become greater as the further down you go. So my little stick man right here, okay, make him smile, has got a 50-pound load in his hands. He's holding it 2 feet out. Or you can say sheep, doesn't really matter. And so you're 50 pounds, you're hanging it out here, and you want to solve for what are the compressive forces on the spine with this. So as you know, and again, this is just a simple stick model, but it helps you understand the fundamental concept of biomechanics in terms of where are we in terms of forces and why do we hurt our backs and what is the magnitude of those forces. Person standing straight up, 50 pounds, just like this. In order to keep that person from rotating, right, there has to be a tremendous amount of force counteracting these forward forces to keep them from rotating forward. So solving for X is basically the distance of the spine, the spinal column, to the erector spinae muscles, right? We're just going to look at those for right now. And those erector spinae muscles now are locked in to the spine, clamping down, putting forces on the spinal column, which results in solving this, 50 pounds, 2 feet out, solving for X. This is our distance here between the spine and the erector spinae, and we have 600 pounds of force, compressive force, just coming down on the spine for an average individual. Someone like me, we're way over 1,000. Why? Because of the size, the mass added, right? The internal forces as well as the external forces. Now, if you add that to a forward flexion, now you're 1,500, 1,600 pounds. Now we're going to put in lateral rotation. Now you're talking about an amazing 2,000 pounds plus on one side because now you're unstable. So you can imagine, and most of you have experienced this in some time, where you tried to do manual handling, moving something, getting yourself into an awkward position, and you say, oh, I think I just did something, right? Or maybe you don't notice it then, but the next day, it's like, I can't get out of bed. I hurt myself, right? Because you did something. I want you to remember this. It's in the hundreds, if not the low thousands of pounds, write that down, of compressive forces on the spine. So if you come back and say, oh, it must be 1,000,000 pounds of compressive force, that's wrong. It must be 10 pounds of compressive force, that's wrong. But even in the lightest of applications right here, standing straight up, 50 pounds, you're now getting hundreds of pounds of pressure on that disc. Actually, series of discs, but now if it's unstable, it's even worse, right? So that's how it all comes out. So now we get into man material handling. This is what you're going to be seeing from the green book that you're going to download for free if you haven't done it already. And it shows you how to do these things. It's very practical. See this little line going straight down? This is really a reflection of where that, we call it the center of pressure. Sometimes they'll call it the center of gravity, which is wrong, center of pressure, where someone's standing. Because most people don't stand straight like this, and handle. They usually will stagger themselves, right, in terms of balance. So what you do is you sort of take that center point between the two heels right here and run that line straight up, and that's your 0 point. And then where you're handling the load, right there, that's the distance out then from where you're moving the object. So in this case here, they're moving out from this point, foot forward, to the center of that load, about 10 inches, and that would be known as your horizontal distance. And you're going to find out that the horizontal distance is the killer in terms of the amount of discount that occurs when you're doing material handling. There's movement, right? Distance. There's vertical location, being on the floor, being on a countertop, being over the head. There's twisting involved. There's frequency involved. But at the end of the day, the horizontal, in terms of this mathematical model, just remember this, that's going to take you out. That will take you out more than anything else. That'll nail you. And if you can figure out a way to reduce that, then you're going to get the best recovery of the weight that you're handling in terms of reducing risk for the back. Everyone good with that? Okay. So this is over at the Veterans Home. They were trying to teach nurses and nurses' aides how to do patient handling and so on. Do we have an issue with this kind of lift? This is actually involved in a training video. Can anyone see this real quick? How about my PTs, OTs? Can you see anything here? First, we got a big H, right? A big horizontal. She's using her thigh, which is great. She's kind of brace herself a little bit against the bed, and she's rotating the patient, right? So a lot of times patients will soil themselves, or they just need the sheets changed or whatever. So they roll them, put the sheet on, and then fold it back, then roll them the other way, right, and put the sheet out and so on. So we're going through this bit, but you can see that she's asymmetric, and she's got a large H right there. What could we do to improve that? Yes?
You can raise the bed.
Excellent. Raise the bed, or?
You can also drop, bend at the knees, put the feet in a more stable position.
But certainly take out the asymmetry, right, in terms of, square up against the bed. How about moving the patient a little bit closer to you, right, slide them, because there are a lot of these now devices slide. You don't want to slide them so far that they're going to fall over, right? You don't want that to happen. But, in this case right here, the patient could be moved a little bit closer. You could square up in terms of patient handling and get rid of this asymmetry. Try to reduce that this H as best you can. And all this business that you hear about going out and getting someone to give you a hand and do this and that, I can tell you for a fact it's not going to happen. They're just not the human resources out there that are going to help you out. It just doesn't happen. How about this one right here? Another practice move. She's kind of laughing because she's thinking, if I drop this lady, I'm dead, right? Look at that H, way out there, right? Trying to get her up. This lady would probably qualify for some kind of lift assist, right? In terms of that, maybe some kind of lifting device or something to safely get her out. Because one of the things that we found that a lot of nurses assistants suffer back injuries, not so much in doing this, but when they drop the patient and they try to make it like it didn't happen. They try to reach down and scoop them up and pick them up, and that's when they blow out their backs, right? It's like, oh my God, they freak, right? The adrenaline's pumping and they're not going anywhere. Not something with this size differential. So this particular lift, you can get in a little bit closer to this patient lift, but I would say looking at that size differential, let's say someone would be handling me, definitely a lift device, would be in order, and it's worth it to invest in those things just because of the cost of back injuries. There are tens of thousands of dollars. Okay, I'm going to get into this, and what I strongly encourage you to do, read the book over the weekend. It's easy read. Like I said, it's only 51 pages, but more important, look at the example problems that follow. The only ones I'm going to hold you responsible for are the individual lifts. If you get a little further into this, there are actually calculations you can do for multiple lifts where you do additive and so on, do the sum of what the risk is. Don't have to worry about that part. It's only static. So something that's a risk at the beginning, something that's a risk at the end. That's what we're going to be focusing on with this class, because I really want you to get that concept down. Also, I put out a little note. How many of you have Apple computers, iPods, so on and so forth? If you do, and I put this note out just to make sure it's real clear, it's not going to put you at any advantage over the other students that have Androids or MS-DOS-based systems. But last year, I was very fortunate. I worked with a student who created an app, and it's got some great reviews. It's called the NIOSH RWL. If you go to the Apple store, you can find that, and you can get it for $3. It's $2.99 for the download. $1 goes to Apple. They get their cut. It's a pretty big cut, I think, 33%. The other dollar goes to the student, and the third dollar would go to me. but instead of going to me, it actually goes to the Human Factors and Ergonomics Club here on Purdue's campus. That's already worked out. I think there's going to be some article that's going to, talk about that kind of thing. But I can tell you that it's, for the money, it's not a bad thing. But what's fun about that, if you do have an Apple product, is being able to play with the calculations and see what you gain and lose by changing the configurations. It works both in metric as well as English units. And you can mix and match it, and that's one of the reasons why it's got some good reviews, is that people over in Europe have been using it. They tend to use the metric system. And here in the U.S., we use the English system. If they want to mix it up, they can do that. You still get the same answer. So, obviously it's something that I'm kind of proud of, and the idea of giving back, to the students of the university was my goal in this mission in creating the app. And so far it's doing okay in terms of the market. More interesting, it's like European sales are outpacing the U.S. sales on this thing. It's not like a Stephen King thing where it's all kind of flying in. No, it's not like that at all. But I think for a class like this, it might be quite useful if you want to take a look at it, where you can apply the numbers and get your answers right away. So all of that relates to what you're about to hear now in terms of the NIOSH lifting equation. As I mentioned, this is something that only exists from the federal government to tell you the risk for a back injury. Nothing about the upper limbs or the lower limbs, the neck, any of that business. And of course, the motivation is it's just very costly. So there were two models out there. Oops. No, I have my thing. There was an 81 model. An 81 and a 91. And we're going to talk about both of them. When you take the test in here, I'll ask you to identify certain differences between the 81 and the 91. But when it comes to quantifying and coming up with answers, you'll definitely see that in the midterm. I'll only focus on the 91 equation, okay? Because they're vastly different from each other. The 91's a little more complicated. So the first one came out in 1981. And it did a number of things. It was tried in court, and people said, well, it's great, but it doesn't have some features that we'd like to see out there, realistic features. And those features are, you're not accounting for any coupling like handles, and you're not accounting for twisting. And so that had to be factored in, some 10 years later into this particular model. And the idea is that if you're going to factor that in, you have to have some similarity between the 81 and the 91, because so many people were using the 81 model for about a decade, and they say, well, we don't want to scrap that whole thing. We want to be able to sort of use the principles behind that. So can we add these other features to the 91 model and still have a semblance of some identification with that original model? Why do I know this? Because this is the kind of stuff that I was doing before coming here, is helping develop these models. So we got into this then. We want to find out a couple of things, and these are keys. This is a recommended weight limit and the lifting index. The recommended weight limit is that, keep in mind, is that if you're handling a certain weight, what the model is telling you is that in order to safely handle what you're doing, that the weight should be so much. So let's say I'm handling a 40-pound weight and I'm in an awkward posture. The model comes back and said, in order to safely handle this, you need to do it maybe 23 pounds to be safe. It'll come back that way. When they say, well, what's the difference between what you're handling and what the recommended weight limit is, that's the ratio of that is the lifting index. So in this case here, if you quickly do the math, if I say I'm handling 40 pounds and saying doing 23 pounds, then you're looking at about 1.8 times higher, right? One being like an odds ratio where you're not seeing that risk, but anything above 1, you're starting to see an increased risk now for back injury. Does that make sense, everybody? That's your lifting index. So we go back to this graphic that you saw a little bit earlier in terms of handling. So we got our horizontal, the H, I told you that's really important. We have our starting point right here. This would be your vertical one, or V1. Write that down. Your V1 is your starting point, and then the place where you stop is your V2. So up here, this is a V2, And the distance, the D, is the difference between V1 and V2. Really focus on what I just said. The distance is the difference between V1 and V2. So it's between here and here. That difference is your D, and that's a calculation that you have to do. So intuitively, if you looked at this, would the risk be greater lifting from here, 22 inches off the ground, or lifting off the ground? Which is worse, lifting off the ground or lifting at 22 inches high? Off the ground. How many agree? Why is that? You kind of know that intuitively a little bit. Why?
The further bend.
You have to be, okay, you bend down further, because so visually you understand that, but what's the biomechanical reason behind that?
You have more forces.
Oh, right, higher forces, right, because of the posture, but you also have all this weight, right, that you're now managing, right? So it's the internal forces in addition to the external forces, right, that you have to put together. So you saw this in terms of twisting. We came up with a solution there. Same thing here. So we're going to this this 91 model. It was first published in the literature. It was released in 91, but actually published in 93. And it basically gets out is it looking from front to back in terms of movement. And the compressive forces, this is what a cutaway looks like in terms of the spine. You know, give us some structure, but lightweight. And this is what it looks like between the disc right here. And when we look at the disc and its ruptures, what kind of substance comes out of it? Is it jelly? It's more like a consistency of crab meat. It's not crab meat. Consistency of crab meat. I know I'm getting an answer of crab meat. There's crab meat back there. Of course, there's your spine going down to the bottom. Where's our risk? Right? Right down here. Right? Your L5, S1. Next is your L4, L5. Very good. And this is just a nice little cross-section of the back. Which is the front, which is the back? Is this the back of the back or the front? Right? We have the spinal process going back. Why? Because you can feel it. Put your hand back there, you can actually feel the spines going through, and this is where all the muscles pass through, the tendons and the ligaments between the bones. Passing through the spinal cord right here. Better view of it, top down. And right here, this is where you have your herniations. And this is coming down. This part down here, down toward the coccyx. But what's this? So those of you that took anatomy, what's that called? The cauda equina, right? Remember that? Equina being horse. The cauda tail, right? The horse's tail. Basically, this is where all the nerves now fan out to basically give you that function of the lower limbs and sensations there. So a little more here, and this is where the problem is when these herniate, it presses up against the nerves. Extremely painful. Nothing funny about this. Hurts like the dickens. But in many instances, what people don't realize is that a lot of times the body will heal itself, pull that back in. It'll form some scar tissue around there, but in many instances, the body, when it heals itself, if you're not continuing to hurt it in the same way, will stop pinching on that nerve. So what most won't tell you is that if you go to back surgery, your positive outcome, what are your chances? You want to write this down because it's still true. You can look in the literature. It's 50-50. 50% chance from spinal surgery of getting better. If someone tells me, you put it in real terms, it's the flip of a coin. It comes down, heads are going to get better, tails is going to get worse, they're going to stay the same. I'm going to be thinking, maybe we don't want to go in there and start cutting. Maybe we want to think about this. And why a lot of people do like to have surgery because they think it's going to be better. Sometimes it is, spinal fusions and so on, and especially if it's just so debilitating they can't do anything, then something has to be done. But in many instances with back pain, if you stop subjecting yourself to that same instance where you're hurting, mechanical movement or so on, the body will heal itself over time. Different muscles in the back. It's obviously the supports and ligaments now. You had a little bit of that earlier. And then look, the government, while they're interested in that, back injuries account for nearly 20% of all injuries, I'm holding you responsible for this. Back injuries account for nearly 25% of the annual workers' compensation payments. Think about that. 1 out of 4 workers' comp payments for a bad back. That's a big deal. Overexertion, most common cause of occupational injury. 31% of all injuries are overexertion. The back, the body part most frequently affected, over 22% there. 1.7 million injuries per year that are documented from backs. So we're going to do a couple more of these slides and we'll call it quits. I want you to, this looks extremely simple, but I can flip this around for you. The strain index, this is basically looking at the demands of the job and what the worker is capable of. When the demands of the job exceed what the worker is capable of, that strain index increases, thus the risk for back injury increases. And so we look at the 81 equation. We're going to look at these 4 things. We're going to revisit them, and that is that we're looking at the musculoskeletal injury rates and severity rates, and shown to increase significantly when above a maximum permissible limit. Circle these numbers right here, because look at where we are. Look at that 1,430 pounds, 650 kg or 1,430. Right here, metabolic rates here exceed 5.0 kilocalories per minute. Where does that come from if I'm talking about biomechanics? Another important take-home point. That comes from things of movement, of stooping down and lifting, right? So there's a physiologic parameter to that, and then the location of the load, whether you're lifting from the floor or from the waist or overhead. So it's that, the physiology now kicks in, right? That's where the metabolic element comes into the movement. So it's not just only about compressive forces, it's actually about the movement aspect as well and location of the load. So don't forget that part. Last 2 points, we'll call it quits, and that is that we're looking at only 25% of the men, get this, and only 1% of the women would have the muscle strength capable of performing work with a maximum permissible limit. Think about that, ladies. The way they had this designed is that you had no chance of doing any kind of physical labor according to this, because the risk for getting a back injury was so high that only 1% of the population was really capable of doing that work. We've come a long way since '81. We'll pick this up on Tuesday. Thanks.